Good evening. Welcome to Pryor Center Presents. I'm Bill Schwab. I'm the Executive Director of the Barbara David Pryor Center for Arkansas Oral and Visual History. Tonight we launch our spring program of the third season of Pryor Center Presents with Jeff Gruenewald. And his titled talk is FarRight Flashpoints and the Enduring Threat of Violent Extremism in America. We have 4 additional talks in our spring calendar. On February 10th, Steve Boss, a faculty member in our Department of Geosciences Department, will be talking about far field effects of sea level rise. We are all coastal. There's no better example of far field effects than the Marshall East community in Northwest Arkansas. When something happens in the Marshall Islands, 6,500 miles away, it has a profound impact upon Northwest Arkansas. On March 3rd, Randy Dixon, who is the director of our KETV Channel 7 News Archive, and Kyle Kellums, who does Ozark at Large, are going to be talking about Arkansas news history, the KETV Channel 7 archives. The Pryor Center has the archives. It spans from the 1950s through the 2000s. We're in the process of digitizing the film and the video. It's being posted on our website. We're hoping that Randy and Kyle will sit on our stage, talk about some news history, and we'll run some live clips. It's going to be a great evening. On April 1st, Kevin Fitzpatrick and Matthew Spielik are going to talk about their new book, Hurricane Harvey's Aftermath. Hurricane Harvey happened in 2017. It caused $125 billion worth of damage, and people are still homeless. So it's going to be, I think, an important evening. And finally, on April 21st, Carrie Banton, who is the director of African American Studies program at the university, is going to talk on election identity politics, interrogating group belonging in Black and white republics. I'd like to bring to your attention a program we have on our website. In April of 2019, Siva Vadanathan talked about his book, Anti-Social Media, How Facebook Disconnects People and Undermines Democracy. It is a sobering talk because much of what he introduced in that talk has come to pass over the last 4 months. A few housekeeping issues. We will be taking questions at the end of the talk. Please use the Q&A function on your Zoom to submit a question. And finally, please be gentle and kind. We're all dealing with Zoom. Thank you. In a typical season, we offer 4 talks in the fall and 4 talks in the spring. But with the attack on our nation's capital on January 6th, I thought the Pryor Center could contribute to our understanding of what happened on that day with a pop-up talk by Jeff Gruenewald, the director of the Department of Sociology and Criminology's Terrorism Research Center. Brent Smith was a professor at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. He was an Arkansas native and he wanted to return to his home state. And he joined our faculty in 2003 and brought with him the American Terrorism Study. Since 2003, the center has received a dozen grants from the National Institute of Justice, totaling more than $8 million, with additional funding coming from the Department of Homeland Security. So for the last 2 decades, TRC has studied terrorist activities in the United States. They are also a member of the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Response to Terrorism, or START. And if you want to learn more about the Terrorism Research Center, please go to terrorismresearch, all one word, .uark.edu in your web browser. Jeff Gruenewald received his BA and his MA from Indiana University and his PhD from Michigan State University in 2009. He is an associate professor, and upon Brent Smith's retirement this year, he became the director of the Terrorism Research Center. He leads the American Terrorism Study and the Bias Homicide Database housed at the TRC. Jeff has published more than 40 studies on issues related to domestic violent extremism, murder, and media representation of violence in America. He is also the co-editor of Right-Wing Extremism in Canada, the United States, set to be published later this year by Palgrave Macmillan Press. So Jeff, welcome to the Pryor Center and Pryor Center Presents. How did you ever get interested in terrorism research?
Well, thank you, Bill, for having me, and everybody else for signing in. I think me getting into terrorism research had a lot to do with just timing. I think I was pretty shaken by the Oklahoma City bombing, and a year later we had the Olympic Park bombing in Atlanta, and I had a lot of questions as a young man about how these attacks could occur, how former military individuals could carry out such attacks against innocent Americans, and moving on to Indiana University as an undergraduate student majoring in criminology. I remember the Oklahoma City bomber, who was held at the federal penitentiary there in Terre Haute, not too far away. And, having big questions about terrorism, but also the death penalty. There's a lot of demonstrations and protests against the death penalty. He was to be executed there in Terre Haute. And I didn't know at the time, but the criminological study of terrorism was really taking off. Previously, it had been really dominated by psychologists and political scientists. So I think I was just in large part in the right place at the right time. And I had a lot of questions. And so just before 9/11, I was pursuing law enforcement. I was in the police academy there at Indiana University, but I was also a McNair Scholar. McNair Scholar is someone who, is getting some financial help because they're underrepresented. I was a first generation student, and I had to connect with a faculty member and do some research in order to keep the scholarship. So I reached out to a faculty member who was writing a book on the militia movement, which was a very interesting topic to me. It kind of overlapped with some of my questions about the Oklahoma City bombing. And so, he had me do the things that someone writing a book doesn't want to do, like format tables and format reference sections. And I became enamored with the research process. And I was realizing we didn't know that much about domestic extremism in the US. And so shortly after 9/11 happened, and of course that changed everything for so many people. And so I left the police academy and decided that I wanted to pursue terrorism research as a career. So I thought that I could make a difference. Of course, I can make a difference as law enforcement, but I also thought I could make a difference with research and trying to fill some of these gaps in our understanding of domestic extremism. So I went to Michigan State, got a PhD, wrote a dissertation on FarRight Murders, which coincidentally I'm talking about tonight. I've been studying multiple forms of violent extremism since about 2009.
Great, thank you. Does the Research Center study terrorism across the political spectrum?
Yes, yeah, I think we study radical Islamic terrorism, we study eco-terrorism, left-wing terrorism. I think we probably, for the most part over the last decade, I think we probably study more of radical Islamic terrorism for obvious reasons, especially after 9/11. That's what research funders were primarily interested in. So, as well as eco-terrorism. And I'll talk about this later in my talk, but one of the things that we do is to look at them comparatively. How do the weapons and the motivations and the outcomes compare across these different ideologies? So it's important for us to study all of these different movements. I think it's also hard to talk about all of them in one single talk. I think when I talk about eco-terrorism, I usually have someone say, why aren't you talking about these other movements? And then when I talk about radical Islamic terrorism, they say, yeah, but what about the extreme far right? So I completely understand, but I do want to, I guess, say up front, when we talk about extreme left terrorism, extreme right terrorism, we're not talking about left-wing, right-wing politics, right? We're not talking about Republicans and Democrats. Everyone I'm talking about tonight has committed a lethal attack in furtherance of an ideological, social, political cause.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Well, without any further ado, Jeff Gruenewald and far-right flashpoints and the enduring threat of violent extremism in America. Thank you, Jeff.
All right, so hopefully you can see that all right. Somebody let me know if you cannot. Send me a message or a text. But again, I want to thank you for being here on a Thursday night during dinner time to have a discussion about the extreme far right. I understand why there's interest, considering what happened a couple of weeks ago. Usually it takes a lot more effort for me to get an audience to talk about far right extremism. So I'm flattered, but I'm humbled, and I hope that I can answer some questions, but during the talk, but even more importantly, after the talk. My plan is to not talk too long so that we can get to Q&A. So as we all know, on the afternoon of January 6th, thousands of rioters marched from this rally, the Stop the Steal rally, held by the former President Trump and his allies. And they went to the US Capitol building, where individuals broke through security measures. Here they're breaking through the windows, and they're illegally entering one of the most sacred buildings to American democracy. So, I think it's worth recognizing that the majority of these people who were present did not engage in violence, but they were there to protest the counting of electoral votes to certify now President Biden's win of the 2020 election. Recent media reports, though, that there several people, many people there who were there, who we've referred to as rioters, as insurrectionists, as violent extremists, and yes, domestic terrorists that day. And they wanted to physically stop the certification process. They wanted to overturn the fair election results and possibly to commit violence against elected officials in doing so. So we know now that 5 people died that day, including a Capitol police officer. And of course, many more were injured, who we talk about much less. But some of the extremist groups present that day, I didn't initially want to give them much attention, but I figure we are, we're seeing a lot of these names in the media reports. So I wanted to give a little bit of additional context on these groups. One of them is the Oath Keepers there in the top right, a conspiratorial anti-government group created largely in response to President Obama's election several years ago. So we can point them out with their fatigues, their semi-automatic weapons hanging around their shoulders. They work really hard. I think thinking about how are these groups unique, they work really hard to recruit former and current law enforcement and military and others who have taken the oath to defend the Constitution. So they believe that their role, which is similar to many militia groups in the past, their role is to step in when they believe the police, the National Guard, will not defend the Constitution, at least their interpretation of this situation. They're there to step in. We have the Proud Boys, which is becoming a more and more prominent group. Another extreme far-right group, neo-fascists, characterized by ultra-nationalism, of course, white supremacy, xenophobia, nativism, authoritarianism, all the isms. They wholeheartedly believe that former President Trump, they believed him when he said that the election was stolen from him. And they were ready to take on the federal government and take up his cause. And they wanted to ensure that he could remain president. And we saw them there at the riot pretty prominently. We also have the Boogaloo Boys, a strange mix of members and beliefs, and a strange name, but it's a pretty loosely put together movement, some conflicting beliefs, but they are all hell bent on ushering in this second civil war and the overthrow of the federal government. So that is what binds them. They're pro-gun advocates. They're disenchanted with the overreach of government, and this carries on, which is one of the themes of my talk. This carries on. It extends this idea of being concerned about overreach of the government is one of the constancies across the decades. So some are racist, some are not, but they can be recognized by their questionable attire of Hawaiian shirts and military fatigues. And of course, the QAnon followers, which were pretty prominent, and they're prominent in the news since the riots. This is a pretty wild conspiracy. Maybe the most wild of all the conspiracies currently, alleging there's a cabal of cannibalistic, satanic, child trafficking individuals who are essentially made up of Hollywood execs and Democratic elites and probably college professors. And they believe that some intelligence insider who goes by the name of Q is communicating with them about the deep state corruption. And they're doing this through the internet, which is another theme through this of the talk, is kind of the power and the influence of the internet over the last few decades. So they believe that Trump was the Messiah, and that he was going to, well, at least prior to the election, he was set to, there's going to be this big arrest, which would occur, which means that the election would not happen. And then after, of course, President Biden was elected, it became about turning their attention to overturning the unfair rigged election. And that's where it turned to storming the Capitol. And so today, if you look at the media reports, there's a lot of confusion among the QAnon followers. Some are discouraged, some are saying go back to your normal lives, while others are trying to make sense of it and move on to the next conspiracy. But hundreds of individuals, many belonging to these groups, they've been arrested. Last I checked, it was well over 200, and they've been arrested on charges like entering a restricted building, violent entry, disorderly conduct, theft, and including a couple high-profile arrests of one man who, on the left here, who beat a police officer with a flagpole, and another man who broke into Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi's office. So I know there's probably a lot of Arkansas residents on the webinar, so I'm sure you're well aware of this. So I guess one of the questions we're all asking, I know I'm asking, is how could law enforcement let what we're calling the Capitol insurrection happen? And counterterrorism expert and a friend of mine, David Carter from Michigan State, he said, sometimes the best intelligence in the world doesn't translate into adequate preparedness. Perhaps security officials responsible for protecting the Capitol simply could not envision that a crowd of Americans would charge through a police line and shatter the glass windows that stood as the only barrier to entering the building. And then he continues on channeling the 9/11 Commission report, which is one of the first things I thought of as well. It was just a failure of imagination. And we've seen this in the headlines too. They didn't imagine something like this. Would you imagine people were going to break into the Capitol and go into the chambers? So, and then he goes on. And I think that that's another theme that carries through this talk, and something we'll talk about at the end is how do we make sure that we learn from this. Just like after 9/11, we had to learn an immense amount about, we had considerable intelligence prior to 9/11. The 9/11 Commission report lays this out very well. Law enforcement intelligence about all of the training going on in the years prior. And we had the 9/11 Commission, which was pretty damning of the law enforcement intelligence community and information sharing. So I imagine that this is a real possibility, that we could have such a commission after the Capitol riots. Another reason such a heinous crimes could occur at what we would consider a very secure Capitol building is that the National Guard was hesitant to make a move. At least this is what's being reported. Some felt that because of the controversial nature of the National Guard presence at the Black Lives Matter protest the previous summer, and perhaps in combination with reports that martial law could be declared to keep the president in power. Some just felt that one of the influences on this intelligence and law enforcement failure was they were just trying to avoid the optics of bringing in the National Guard. So just to be clear, it was known that there was a lot of chatter, online chatter by extreme far righters. We knew that they felt that the election had been stolen, that these people would be coming from places like Arkansas to the Stop the Steal rally in DC. But extreme anti-government rhetoric on the internet is not new. Another theme of this talk is, we've been, analysts have been studying this type of chatter for, well, I guess we could say decades now. And the question is, how are they to know that this chatter was any different, right? Why should they think that this type of chatter could actually manifest into organized violence against the federal government? So I'll get to this more in a bit, but a key question moving forward should be, how do we distinguish between more benign threats and more serious threats, at least in the online realm? What happened was certainly shocking. I still think about watching it all unfold on TV, which I'm sure a lot of you do too. But the conspiracies and the grievances underlying this deadly violence that killed Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick, they're not new in the United States. And so for the purposes of this webinar, I want to define far-right violent extremists as those who are considered to have committed ideologically motivated attacks against the government or attacks against others because of their identity, their social status. And we're talking about white supremacists, white nationalists, members of the militia and patriot movement over the years, and groups that I've already mentioned, Proud Boys, Boogaloo Boys. But also, I want to say this very clearly, that simply having or uttering extreme beliefs or having right-wing beliefs or considering yourself as a fundamentalist, mainstream political religious movement, it does not make you a violent far-right extremist. You're not in the data. These individuals are not in the data that I'm discussing. You have to commit in this case, a deadly crime, a murder, to further a political and social agenda to be considered, for my purposes, a violent far-right extremist. So, and I will talk about, I know we just talked about early on the left-wing attacks. I will compare what's going on with extreme far-right murders compared to radical Islamic murders and extreme left murders. But the focus, again, today is on these deadly attacks over the last 30 years. So I recognize I could go back to the end of the Civil War and talk about the violence of the Ku Klux Klan, but the research I'm presenting today is primarily based on data from the Extremist Crime Database, which includes data going back to 1990. So we've got about 30 years of data. So the way that far-right extremist groups like the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, the way they dress, whether it's a polo or Hawaiian shirt, it is somewhat unique and from groups of prior eras. We know that neo-Nazi skinheads, they've shaved their heads, they've wore Doc Martin boots. So subcultural differences in ways they dress, it has shifted over time. But importantly, the personal, the social, and the political grievances underlying this extremism are nothing new. I've been studying them for quite a long time, and there's a lot of consistency. So far-right extremists have long held that anti-government conspiracies, they've had these conspiracies that the federal government has been infiltrated and controlled by international forces and is being, kind of puppets to groups like the United Nations. They've long feared that the federal government wants to infringe on Second Amendment rights. And to them, gun ownership is critically important because of the ever impending belief that there's this apocalyptic race war that's coming. And so you'll hear that, perhaps you heard that at the riots talking about the revolution. Violent far-right extremists, they've long believed that their social and their political power is being threatened. And again, this could go back to the end of the Civil War as well. But they believe that the white majority is slipping away. They fear being replaced. We've heard at Charlottesville chanting, "We will not be replaced," right? It's pretty clear. It doesn't take a far-right extremist researcher to tell you this. And so they see signs of increasing immigration. They see policies favorable to those who are not English-speaking whites. They see these as threats to American culture, to American, what they perceive as American values. So It's also not new that they are overwhelmingly white males who often perceive themselves as being left behind by society. So they're not able to achieve what their parents, their father and their grandfather was able to achieve. They see themselves as a victim of a changing society. They find enemies in feminism. And they have a reality of reduction in working class jobs, which is keeping them from reaching their potential as white men. So, I want to shift now to talk kind of about my research over the last, I guess, 15 years now. The research findings are based primarily on data from the U.S. Extremist Crime Database. This is a collaboration from the Terrorism Research Center at the University of Arkansas, but also Michigan State University, John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City, and Seattle University. So this is a big team effort over the last 15 years. So it's an open source database. It includes information on multiple types of violent extremism, eco-terrorism, whether it's the arsons, the bombings that they commit, the radical Islamic violence, murders, conspiracy to commit murders. And what I'm talking about today, in light of the Capitol insurrection, is the extreme far-right murders. So the ECDB, there's been over 60 peer-reviewed studies published on these data, not just by me, by several others. And we've had multiple student dissertations, student theses. We have several going on here at the University of Arkansas currently, and this has been determined to be a reliable data source on this topic. The Government Accountability Office has deemed it to be reliable in thinking about the scope and what's included in the database. And also peer-reviewed research has really looked at the methodology, the open source methodology, and assessed it to be reliable. All of the extreme far-right murders in the ECDB, they involve one or more offender who's affiliated with the extreme far right, and they all had to be motivated by ideology. Just acknowledging that someone who's an extreme far rightist can also commit a murder that's not motivated by ideology, and that's not what I'm talking about today. Although we do have data on those. At least one victim had to be killed, and one offender had to be charged for a case to be included in the ECDB, unless, of course, it was all the offenders were killed during the commission of the attack, such as a suicide mission. So, research shows the frequency and nature of the far-right ideologically motivated murders. It's varied across decades. It's varied across presidential terms. This is a figure in an article I published with The Conversation. During the 1990s, I guess I want to say there's never been a year during this time frame where there hasn't been an extreme far-right murder. So this is something that does happen multiple times every year. During the 1990s, during the Clinton administration, actually, this is when a disproportionate amount of these murders actually occurred. Similar to what we are hearing today, the Oklahoma City bomber wanted Americans to wake up and to start a revolution during this was actually 1995. So what was going on in the 1990s? Well, we had people who were losing their family farms across the country to the banks. We had a lot of real concerns about overreach, federal government overreach, if you remember, or at least you've heard about the siege on Ruby Ridge, Idaho. We had the siege on the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. So people feared that the federal government was coming for their guns during this time. And, you know, based on the political rhetoric of the last several years, we know that these fears have never really gone away. The 2000s experienced, interestingly to me, the least amount of extreme FarRight murders in comparison to the other decades included in the data. And why this is so is, you know, up for speculation, but it could be perhaps because of the fallout from the response. So we had the federal government, law enforcement really, you know, trying to repress the far-right violence after Oklahoma City, understandably. We also had the country coming together in some ways after 9/11, seeing past differences. But these fatal attacks, you know, the ones that did occur during this time, they were more likely to target immigrants and those that were perceived to be Muslim or of Arab descent. So that was something that was kind of unique about this time. And of course, that makes sense, or at least it is to be expected after 9/11. So the attacks during this time, they were declining, but we also had a resurgence, if you remember, in patriot groups during this time. And we had a increase in some inflammatory immigration rhetoric. We also had a Great Recession and people who were losing their jobs, working class, middle class jobs. They were losing their homes. And we had during this time a major spike in white nationalism and anti-government groups leading up to the election of the first African-American president, President Obama. So yes, the number of fatal attacks may have been declining during this time, but we had group membership in these types of groups increasing dramatically. And so as we know now, the anti-immigrant rhetoric would only get more divisive and more extreme in recent years. The Obama era witnessed a spike in hate crimes, but it also witnessed a spike in mass casualty attacks, especially by far-right extremists. So this was something that changed during this time. So the threat was the threat of far-right violence was enduring, but it was changing in its nature. Mass shootings, if you remember, occurred at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC. We had the Sikh temple shooting in Wisconsin. We had the Charleston Massacre shooting, South Carolina, at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. We also saw during this time a tax protester fly a plane into an IRS building in Texas. We saw which hits close to home, the assassination of Arkansas police officers on the side of the road by so-called sovereign citizens. So during the Obama era, the carnage of mass shootings, it sparked a lot of debate and maybe set the stage for a lot of the inflammatory rhetoric that we've seen in the last few years. But the display of Confederate flags, monuments from the Confederate era, debates about whether to call these mass shootings versus acts of domestic terrorism, these were really heating up during this time. The point about mass shootings by extreme far right is the number of, after Oklahoma City bombing, the number of individuals who were killed per murder went from 1.4 in the 90s to today, it's 2.4 victims. So these are just much deadlier attacks that are occurring today. So our research shows that, extreme far-right murderers, they're overwhelmingly white males. They're slightly, in comparison to other types of extremists who are committing violence in the US, eco-terrorists, radical Islamic terrorists, they are slightly older. They're less educated in terms of educational attainment, and they're more likely to have prior arrest histories. And this includes any type of prior arrest, not necessarily ideologically motivated. So this is one of the things that we're able to do by comparing multiple types of violent extremism in the US, is we're able to identify some uniquenesses across ideologies. Who's most likely to be targeted? Well, it's similar to what the FBI hate crime statistics consistently show. Racial and ethnic minorities are disproportionately targeted by far-right extremists in when it comes to murders. And the next most common victim type is government officials, and this is most always state and local police officers who are being gunned down by extreme far-rightists. And I know that the January 6th incidents, it was a federal police officer, and we'll talk about a couple more instances where federal officers were killed, but overall, it's usually state and local officers who are being targeted by the extreme far-right. Yeah, the harm of extreme far-right murders to communities and society more generally, I would suggest is heightened in a couple different ways. First, these murders are, like I said, they're more likely to result in multiple deaths than more common forms of murder, where you tend to have one victim. They're also, we're seeing an upward trend in the number of people who are killed. But also we've seen a number of far-rightists who are willing to die for their cause when committing ideologically motivated murders. One of the topics we research is suicide terrorism, or murder-suicides by extreme far-rightists, where they may commit suicide after going on a killing spree, or put law enforcement in a situation where suicide by police is the only option. Also, research has found that law enforcement around the country, they continue to consider the extreme far right to be one of the most serious threats to them in their communities. And this was long before January 6th. They're often targeted in attacks where they have little knowledge about the extreme far rightist bias, ideological worldview. And most officers, we've published a couple studies looking specifically at law enforcement deaths due to the hands of extreme far rightists. They're usually killed in surprise attacks and with little escalation of violence. And it happens during routine police work, whether it's a traffic stop, like it happened years ago for the Arkansas police officers, or calls for services at residences, is how they're being killed by extreme far rightists. So how does the threat of extreme far-right murders compare to that of radical Islamic terrorists in the US? So when you compare by absolute numbers, there's no question. Radical Islamic terrorists have killed more innocent people simply due to the 9/11 attacks. You got 3,000 people killed during these attacks. But it may be worthwhile to look at, well, what's happened since the 9/11 attacks. And extreme far-right terrorists we know have killed more people in more fatal incidents since the 9/11 attacks. This does not take away from the number of absolute tragic deaths in 9/11, but it's something that we need to consider looking back the last 2 decades. We have to remain vigilant against the threats of radical Islamic terrorism, but we also need to acknowledge that, the primary threat of violent extremism, deadly violent extremism in the US has come from the far right in the last 20 years. So, and I alluded to this before, during the 9/11 attacks, we had 72 law enforcement officers killed, 55 military personnel killed by Al-Qaeda on that one day. In 1995, at Oklahoma City bombing, we had 13 law enforcement officers and 4 military personnel killed. And if we remove these 2 outlier cases, these 2 statistical outliers, we see that the government officials are more often killed by extreme far rightists than radical Islamic terrorists. Extreme left murderers, and as Bill alluded to earlier on, there was some questions about if you're going to talk about the extreme far right murders, what about the extreme left wing murders? The extreme left, opposing capitalism. I would include the environmental and animal rights activists who, in 2005, the FBI called the most serious domestic terrorism threat. These perhaps promoting anarchy. So how does this type of violence compared to extreme far right violence? So the ECDB does include data on extreme left murders. There has been less research on them. I think just because one reason is just a smaller number of data points. Most of the research that we do is statistically based. So there's just the statistical rarity of these events. And just the interest, I would say until relatively recently, in radical Islamic terrorism, which has kind of dominated the focus of federal funding. But nonetheless, if you look at the numbers, it does appear that the number of extreme left murders of police officers in particular is increasing. I was looking at the data earlier, looking at 2016, where you had killings of law enforcement in Dallas, Texas. If you remember, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, I believe that Dallas, Texas was at a Black Lives Matter protest. And so we do have Black individuals who will go on, and I think it's always been shootings rather than bombings, but they will go on these rampage killings and target both police and people because they are white. So it does occur. We've got to remain vigilant against this form of domestic extremism. If we've learned anything, it's we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. We can't turn our focus to only radical Islamic terrorism and take the focus off the extreme far right. Just like we can't look at just the extreme far right and not pay attention to what's going on the extreme far left. In the U.S., extreme far right murderers, they're usually tried in state courts. They're not going to be tried typically in federal courts as terrorists, and they're all going to, the vast majority is going to receive prison time. 46% are not going to see the light of day. I asked my associate director at the Terrorism Research Center, I said, can you pull some data on on some federal charges of sedition and treason, and she graciously obliged. And so she looked at the data from the American Terrorism Study, and she found that federal charges against extreme far rightists like sedition and treason, they're generally rare. They have a pretty low success rate in terms of convictions. What usually happens is they will be applied, and then the defendants will plead to something less, that is associated with less time in prison. I think it is possible to see a couple of these charges stem from the capital city riots, but I don't necessarily predict that any will be successful in court. So we have many consistencies and belief systems and patterns of deadly violence in the US over the last 30 years, but the social and political context of today is unique. So I know that the title, the theme is the enduring threat, but obviously what's going on in the last few years and the last few weeks is different. And one of the most obvious differences about today's social and political context is we're in the middle of a global pandemic. So people are scared, people are uncertain, they're confused, and some find refuge in anti-government sentiment and conspiracies as an explanation for what's going on. And this manifests in denialism, and this manifests in being anti-masking, and it manifests in fear of government overreach. I've had people close to me say the mask mandate is one step closer to a gun control and disarming the public. So there are increased opportunities also for for online communication. We've got extremists who are able to communicate with each other. They got these encrypted channels, opportunities for spreading misinformation and conspiracies like they haven't had in the past. And so we also have a mainstreaming of violent extremism. So extremists using Twitter and Instagram and memes, trying to use humor and other types of humorous web content to spread some pretty vile conspiracies and dehumanizing content. We also have the rhetorical legitimation of conspiracies, and we have passive approval or direct approval of violence by prominent mainstream politicians. So I believe we'll see much less of this in the new administration. But at the same time, we would be kidding ourselves if we didn't think that this could happen again. Moving forward, I think we've got to recognize the serious and enduring threat of deadly far-right violence. So it occurs every year, some years more than others, but we can't hesitate to label violence that's motivated by political and social ideologies terrorism, whether it's committed by people who are white, whether it's committed by people who are American or not. We've got to learn from the past. If the first Black president resulted in increased extreme activity, then we have to expect the first Black and Asian vice president will do the same. If we know that times of uncertainty lead to more violence, well, then I think that we should expect more violence given the global pandemic. We've got to train our law enforcement around the country to recognize the warning signs of radicalization. It's going to take more effort. It's going to take more funding. We've got to increase university training. Now I'm just plugging my own center. Training for the next generation of intel analysts. We've got to combine the tools of criminology and computer science in our curriculum. We've got to educate our children about tolerance. Now I'm getting preachy. Tolerance and empathy for others. We've got to teach our children how to listen. We've got to incorporate lessons in schools about the threats of misinformation, conspiracies, and online radicalization. And I do believe this has to start in our secondary, primary schools. The Capitol, what happened at the Capitol should be a flashpoint event to help us start talking to our children about these dangers. Finally, we must invest in more empirical research. Again, self-interested here, on the topic of extreme far-right violence. We've got to effectively address this serious problem. We've got to understand its scope and nature. And it's going to require more federal funding and an emphasis on multidisciplinary research teams, and looking at the links now, which are very obvious, between online and offline radicalization. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this talk that ended up being a little bit longer than I expected. If you have any questions, I think we're going to go to Q&A, but otherwise, feel free to email me.
Thank you, Jeff. We have some questions on the Q&A, and we have about 10 or 15 minutes till our hour's over. First question is, where should research on domestic violent extremism go? What don't we know?
I think just my last point about examining online and offline radicalization, I think we've got to focus on that. Over the last 20 years, we've collected a ton of data on terrorism globally, but in the US specifically. We know a lot about the precursors of what leads to terrorist incidents. We do a lot of that research at the Terrorism Research Center, but we don't know much about the indicators of radicalization online. Like, how do we separate, benign chatter from insightful rhetoric that is going to result in organized violence against minorities or against the government? So we know we've got to study white nationalism. We've got to study their use of the internet.
This is a question from Lynn Carver. Is cyberterrorism also included in your database?
I think the general answer is we don't have much data on cyber terrorism attacks. Cyber terrorism, hacking, cyber attacks against the government from foreign nations is something that happens consistently. But to have far-right terrorists, radical Islamic terrorists, eco-terrorists, actually commit ideologically motivated attacks against people, organizations, and government, it just, it doesn't happen yet. So I think that, so I guess the short answer is no, and that, but that we should always be thinking about what's next, right? We don't want a failure of imagination. We know that this is coming, but we don't have a lot of data points from the past.
Patsy Ferreter asked, how much influence could be attributed to unemployment?
I think if you look at over the last several decades, whether it's the unemployment in the 90s, the unemployment in the 2000s, and then the unemployment that we're experiencing now, I think that sets the stage. We can talk about kind of what moves someone from someone who's radicalized to someone who's actually willing to execute an attack. It's a pretty long, complicated process, and it's not a very linear process. But I think that one of the precursor, let's call it pre-radicalization factors that is consistent is losing your job. Along with losing some sort of social attachment, I think that some sort of personal grievance, like losing your job, and that's also more of a broader grievance too. I think that that is one of those major factors that puts people into a cognitive space where they start searching for answers. So I do think actually empirically tracking it's difficult, but I do think there's enough evidence from history to say that it matters.
An attendee asked, did religious extremism play a part in the January 6th Capitol riots?
That's a good question. If you think about some of the groups that were there, Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, that religious ideology, and I want to be careful here. I'm not mainstream religious beliefs, but these socio-historical religious conspiracies that have persisted over several decades. They've always been a part of whether you're talking about white nationalism or whether you're talking about anti-government extremism. And again, those are also overlapping, but religious elements have consistently been a part of this, especially when it comes to thinking about the end times. That there's this apocalyptic race war that involves the overthrow of the government. This is a consistent conspiracy that we've seen for decades and decades, and there is a religious component to it. But it's something that most of us would not recognize as religious, as mainstream religion.
Kevin Fitzpatrick has a question. You've been tracking these right-wing extremist groups like QAnon and the Boys, etc., for some time. Or have they emerged and really developed since the Trump administration? In other words, is this something that is a product of the last 4 years?
No, I think I mentioned one group. I believe it was the Oath Keepers that really emerged around the time of, like a lot of other militia patriot groups, emerged around 2008 with the election of Barack Obama and the Great Recession and things that were going on at that time. So I think that I don't want to let former President Trump off the hook. I think that it's not controversial anymore to say that he played a role in kind of a passive acceptance of violence, like I mentioned before, and even some encouragement for some of these extreme groups. So I think, thinking about QAnon, I think that was more recent, just within the last few years. But some of these other groups, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of these members were part of other groups, in the late 90s and early 2000s that have just kind of followed the emergence of new groups over time. So no, not all of these were created in the last 4 years.
Follow up, do you expect to see a start of a splintering of these groups following the Capitol riot?
Oh, I think it's already happening. I think after the Oklahoma City bombing, we saw groups go underground, obviously, right? The extremist far-right movement was very angry at the Oklahoma City bomber, Timothy McVeigh, because he brought all of this wanted attention onto the extremist movement. And I think that that's going to happen again. I think we're already seeing, for people who were associated with the riot, hundreds of federal indictments. And I think that that's only going to continue over the next few years.
Anna Zaitchik has a question. We passed the Patriot Act, and we developed tools to go after the Islamic terrorists and foreign terrorists. Do we have the same tools available to law enforcement for domestic terrorism?
No, we have less tools. I think you've got individuals who are suggesting that we need to pass legislation to, as we talked about after 9/11, to take the handcuffs off law enforcement so that they could more easily investigate potential threats, violent threats from alleged violent extremists. So no, I don't think that we have the same tools. I think the follow-up question will be, do we want them to have the same tools? I think those, of course, the Patriot Act was very controversial, and a lot of those those pieces of that have been revoked or let expire. But I teach a terrorism class every week, an undergraduate terrorism class. Shout out to them if any of them are here. But we talked about the civil liberties issue of protecting ourselves, and the issue of the fine line between that and civil liberties. So, interestingly, those who spoke up, they said we don't want to do that over again in response to this attack. We don't want to pass that type of legislation.
Well, we're out of time. There's one last question, and it's from Cassie Sullivan. What qualifications do I need to get involved with your work and research?
Well, at the Terrorism Research Center, we have, if you're an Arkansas student, we have 15 to 20 internships available every semester. Also, I've got several other research assistants outside of the internship. But I would say, regardless of your qualifications, if you have an interest, we are very willing to work with you on a research project. We are overflowing with data that we've collected over the last 20 years. And so we love when students and others contact us about potential research projects.
Thank you, Jeff. And we have a record number of questions this evening. Janine Perry and Terry Smeltzer and let's say Bailu Lancaster and others. Sorry we didn't have time to get to your questions. You can email Jeff. What's your email, Jeff?
Yeah, it's J Gruenew, JGRUENEW.
Okay, great.
Actually, I misspelled it. I misspelled UARC. So, but those of you related to the university, it's uark.edu.
Okay, great. Thank you. Wonderful talk, Jeff. And remember all, we have Steve Voss on February 10th talking about far field effects. So good night, and thank you for joining us for Pryor Center Presents Spring Season. Good night.